The muzzle of a .50 cal sniper rifle is steady, but the air around it is screaming. Thunder claps, mimicking the bone-deep vibration of an IED, and suddenly the firing range isn't a training ground, it's a graveyard in a forgotten desert. A young recruit is hyperventilating, his finger white-knuckled on a live trigger. One wrong move, and the line turns into a bloodbath. Would you trust the woman they call the Ghost? Or would you see only the mysterious numbers etched into her skin? The air at the Iron Heights doesn't just sit, it weighs on you. It's a high-altitude wasteland where the wind carries the scent of spent brass and wet earth, a place designed to break the ego before it ever touches a trigger. Under the relentless glare of a late afternoon sun, the firing range buzzed with the mechanical violence of a dozen rifles, bolts snapping back like breaking bone, the rhythmic metallic clang of steel targets being punished at 400 yards. Through the thick of the noise walked Sergeant Mara Vance. Her call sign was Vex, but to the new intake of elite candidates, she was just a ghost in a faded uniform. She moved with a quiet, centered balance, her hood pulled low against the sun's orange haze. There was something unnerving about her stillness. In an environment defined by testosterone and shouted commands, she was a vacuum. But as she approached the firing line, the noise changed. It wasn't the rifles anymore. It was the whispers. On the back of her neck, just above the collar, a string of black ink curved into the skin. Small, precise numbers. Coordinates. They were etched with a surgical exactness that suggested they weren't meant to be art. They were meant to be a record. Think about the sheer arrogance of youth for a second. Imagine being a top-tier candidate, hand-picked for the most grueling evaluation in the military, and looking at a veteran instructor only to see a punchline. What would you see? A map to a favorite bar? A lucky lottery number? Check the ink, one candidate muttered, his voice carrying over the wind. Maybe it's the address of a nail salon she likes. The snicker that followed was infectious. Even a few of the junior instructors, men who should have known better, let a smirk slip behind their polarized lenses. It was that specific brand of casual disrespect that doesn't just sting, it poisons the well. Vex didn't break her stride. She didn't shout. She didn't even look at them. She simply adjusted the sling on her shoulder, brushed a fine layer of grit from her sleeve, and kept walking toward the center of the line. Her eyes, visible only as steady shadows behind her mirrored glasses, remained fixed on the horizon where the targets stood like gray ghosts waiting for judgment. What the recruits didn't see was the way her thumb brushed the edge of those numbers, a subconscious check to see if the weight was still there. It was. Among the candidates stood Miller, a man who possessed the lazy, dangerous confidence of someone who had never truly failed. He was taller than Vex, younger and louder. To him, the Iron Heights was just another trophy to be collected. He watched Vex approach his station, his grip on his customized rifle loose, his breathing shallow not from nerves, but from boredom. "Hey, Sergeant," Miller called out, his voice cutting through the mechanical clatter of the range. "That a treasure map on your neck? Or just a reminder of where you parked the truck?" The line erupted. It was a release of tension, a way for these men to feel superior to the woman who held their careers in her clipboard. But if you looked closely, you'd see the fingers of Vex's left hand twitch just once. A phantom reflex. Up in the observation tower, Commander Elias Thorne watched the exchange. A man whose shoulders looked like they were carved from the very granite of the heights, Thorne wasn't laughing. He had seen quiet before, and usually quiet meant a storm was coming. He had been told a sergeant would be running the final evaluation for his special ops candidates, a decision from high command that sat in his gut like lead. He didn't doubt she could shoot. He doubted if she had the edge to lead his men. Down on the gravel, Vex reached Miller's lane. She stopped. The air seemed to chill by 10 degrees. She didn't address the joke. Instead, she looked at Miller's rifle. The bolt was forward, but the seating was off. A grain of sand, no larger than a speck of dust, had found its way into the lugs. In a high-pressure environment, that tiny speck is the difference between a hit and a catastrophic failure. "Clear your chamber, candidate," Vex said. Her voice was soft, but it had a frequency that bypassed the ears and went straight to the spine. Miller rolled his eyes, a theatrical display for his buddies. He jerked the charging handle back. Click. Nothing. The bolt was frozen. He grunted, his face flushing a deep, angry red as he wrestled with the heavy steel. His knuckles went white, his breath coming in jagged, frustrated bursts. The best of the best was fumbling with his primary weapon in front of the entire line. The laughter died instantly. The silence that followed was heavier than the noise had ever been. It was the kind of silence you find in a room right before a secret is told, or a life is taken. Vex waited. She let him struggle just long enough for the embarrassment to turn into a cold, stinging sweat. Then, without a word, she reached out. She took the weapon from his hands. It wasn't a grab, it was a transition of power. She knelt in the dirt, the grit grinding against her knees, and began to work. Would you have the nerve to stand there while the woman you just mocked dismantled your pride in 10 seconds? Vex's fingers moved with the mechanical grace of a clockmaker. She didn't need to look at the rifle. She felt the obstruction, her touch light but firm. With one sharp, practiced motion, she cleared the lug, reassembled the bolt, and slammed it home. The sound of the metal locking into place was like a gavel hitting a desk. She didn't hand it back. Instead, she shouldered the weapon. She didn't adjust the scope. She didn't check the wind flags. She simply inhaled, her chest rising in a single, fluid motion that seemed to pull the entire range into her lungs. Half a mile away, a steel silhouette sat obscured by the shimmering heat of the afternoon. It was a target no one had touched all day. Vex's finger tightened. The cliffhanger. The rifle barked, a single, deafening report that echoed off the iron heights like a thunderclap. As the brass casing hit the gravel with a high-pitched tink, every eye on the range turned toward the horizon, waiting for the sound that would prove the ghost was either a fraud or a legend. And then it came. The deep, unmistakable ring of lead meeting steel. But as Vex stood up, she didn't look at the target. She looked at Miller, her hood falling back to reveal the full extent of the coordinates on her neck. Just as the radio in her pocket crackled to life with a voice that shouldn't be heard on a training frequency. The metallic ring of lead against steel was still humming through the thin mountain air when the silence broke. It wasn't a shout or a cheer. It was the sound of air being sucked out of the room. Every recruit on the line stood frozen, their eyes darting between the distant, swaying target and the woman who had just hit it without even checking the wind flags. Think about the psychological shift that happens in a second like that. One moment, Miller is the king of the range, laughing at a map on a woman's neck. The next, he's standing next to a ghost who just performed a miracle with his own jammed rifle. What would you do? Would you apologize? Or would the bruise to your ego just make you more dangerous? Miller's face wasn't red anymore. It was a sickly, pale gray. His fingers twitched near his side, his breath coming in shallow, ragged hitches that whistled through his teeth. He looked at the rifle Vex was holding, his rifle, as if it were a foreign object. Vex didn't gloat. She didn't even look at the target. Her focus was entirely on the small, black radio clipped to her shoulder strap. The voice that had crackled through, the one calling for Phantom 9, had turned the atmosphere at the Iron Heights into something pressurized and toxic. Up in the observation tower, Commander Elias Thorne felt the hair on his arms stand up. He wasn't looking at the range anymore. He was staring at a terminal screen, his hands hovering over a keyboard. He began typing, his jaw so tight the muscles pulsed beneath his skin. He was bypass coding into the Army's shadow registry, a place where names go to die. Access denied. He tried again. The hum of the server fans seemed to grow louder, a mechanical snarl in the cramped room. Access denied. Level 5 clearance required. Thorne's pulse hammered against his collar. He looked down at Vex. From this height, she looked small, but the way the other candidates were backing away from her made her look like the center of a blast radius. He realized then that he hadn't just been sent a sergeant to help with drills. He had been sent a secret that was starting to leak. Down on the gravel, the Phantom 9 inches transmission had faded into static, but the damage was done. Vex reached up and clicked the radio off with a definitive snap. She handed the rifle back to Miller. The metal was still warm from the shot, the faint scent of cordite clinging to the receiver. Miller took it, but his hands were shaking so violently the barrel traced small, erratic circles in the air. "The wind is shifting, candidate," Vex said, her voice a low, rhythmic rasp. "It's pulling left at 6 miles an hour now. Adjust your dope or keep missing." She turned her back on him, a move of pure, unadulterated confidence that felt like a slap. But as she walked away, her own composure was fraying. Beneath her gloves, her palms were slick with a cold, greasy sweat. That call sign, Phantom 9, wasn't just a name. It was a funeral bell. It brought back the smell of ozone, the taste of copper in the back of her throat, and the screaming heat of a ridge where the sun never seemed to set. Have you ever had a memory so loud it physically hurts? For Vex, those coordinates on her neck weren't numbers anymore. They were coordinates to a nightmare she had spent 3 years trying to bury under the paperwork of a training instructor. The rest of the afternoon was a blur of mechanical repetition. The recruits shot, the steel rang, and the sun began to dip behind the jagged peaks of the heights, casting long, needle-like shadows across the sand. But the banter was gone. The air was filled only with the sharp crack boom of the rifles and the heavy, rhythmic breathing of men who realized they were being watched by something they didn't understand. Vex moved along the line like a machine. She tapped a barrel down here, adjusted a cheek weld there. Every time she touched a recruit, they flinched. It wasn't fear of her. It was the sudden, crushing weight of her competence. She was fixing their mistakes before they even made them, her eyes scanning the horizon for details no one else could see. The way a blade of grass leaned, the slight shimmer of heat off a rock. As the light failed, turning the range into a world of deep blues and charcoal grays, Thorne descended from the tower. His boots crunched on the gravel, a heavy, deliberate sound that drew every eye. He didn't go to the candidates. He went straight to Vex. He stood 4 inches taller than her, his shadow swallowing her whole. The smell of cold sweat and gun oil was thick between them. "Sergeant Vance," Thorne said, his voice a gravelly rumble. "My office, now." He didn't wait for an answer. He turned and headed toward the command bunker, a concrete monolith built into the side of the mountain. Vex watched him go. She felt the eyes of the recruits, Miller especially, burning into her back. Miller was standing by the gear rack, his knuckles white as he scrubbed at his rifle with a cleaning rag, his eyes fixed on the back of Vex's neck. He wasn't laughing anymore. He was hunting for a reason to hate her. Inside the bunker, the air was stale and smelled of recycled oxygen and old coffee. Thorne didn't sit down. He walked to a heavy steel cabinet in the corner, pulled out a key, and unlocked a drawer that hadn't been opened in months. He pulled out a single, weathered manila folder. It had no name on the tab, just a series of red stamps. Redacted, eyes only, Project Phantom. He tossed it onto the desk. The sound was like a gunshot in the small room. "I spent the last hour trying to find out why a 4-star admiral is personally monitoring my training frequencies," Thorne said, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "I found this in the physical archives. It's an after-action report from a place called the Frozen Ridges." 8 men went in. 1 came out. He stepped closer, his shadow flickering against the concrete wall. The report says the survivor provided cover fire for 12 hours straight with a shattered collarbone and a dry canteen. It says the survivor stayed behind at a set of coordinates to ensure the extraction bird got clear of the kill zone. He pointed a thick finger at the folder, then at Vex's neck. The coordinates on your skin, Mara. They aren't where you live. They're where you died, aren't they? Vex didn't flinch. She stood at a perfect, rigid attention, but the muscle in her jaw was jumping. The room felt smaller, the walls closing in as the ghost of the past filled the space. "I'm an instructor, sir," she said, the words coming out like chips of ice. "My history is irrelevant to the evaluation." "Like hell it is," Thorne snapped. He leaned in, his eyes searching hers for a crack in the armor. "The men out there think you're a joke. But if that folder is right, you're the most lethal thing on this mountain. And if that radio call was real, someone just found out exactly where you're hiding." The cliffhanger. Before Vex could respond, the bunker's emergency lights began to pulse a rhythmic, haunting crimson. A low, vibrating alarm began to groan from deep within the mountain. The active breach signal. Thorne lunged for the security monitor, his eyes widening as the grainy black and white feed showed the main gate. The heavy steel doors weren't being forced, they were being melted. And as Vex looked at the screen, her heart skipped a beat. Standing in the strobe of the alarm was a figure wearing the same tattered desert camo veil she had seen 3 years ago on the ridges. A man who shouldn't exist, holding a transponder that was screaming her coordinates to a fleet of shadows moving in over the peaks. Thorne looked at her, his voice trembling. "Mara, who did you leave behind?" The crimson pulse of the emergency lights transformed the bunker into a rhythmic, bleeding lung. Every 3 seconds, the world vanished into shadow. Every 3 seconds, it reappeared in a harsh, violent red. Outside, the atmospheric shift was even more jarring. The heavy mountain air had finally broken. A wall of freezing rain slammed into the iron heights, turning the dusty range into a chaotic slurry of mud and slate-gray mist. The temperature plummeted, the kind of cold that doesn't just touch the skin. It seeks out the joints and settles there like a dull ache. Commander Thorne's hands flew across the console, but the screen was dying. The grainy image of the front gate, where a figure stood amidst the melting steel, flickered and dissolved into a swarm of digital bees. "Sensors are black," Thorne growled, his voice straining against the low-frequency thrum of the base alarm. "Whatever is out there, it isn't just a breach, it's an erasure." Vex didn't move. She stood in the center of the strobing light, her breathing so slow it was almost non-existent. But look at her hands. Her fingers were dancing against her thighs, a silent, rapid-fire rehearsal of a long-range firing sequence. This is the moment where the human element takes over. When the technology fails and the lights go red, do you freeze, or do you become the machine? "The candidates," Vex said. The words were quiet, but they cut through the siren like a blade. "They're still on the line for the Nightfire simulation." "They have live rounds," Thorne countered, his eyes wide as he looked at the dead monitors. "If they panic in this soup, they'll kill each other before the breach even reaches them. Think about the pressure of a live fire stress test in total darkness. Now add a real-world predator hunting through the rain. What would you do? Would you hold your position, or would every shadow look like a target?" Vex didn't wait for an order. She grabbed a suppressed short-stroke carbine from the wall rack, the metal cold and biting against her palms. She shoved a magazine home, a sharp, mechanical klakschick, and stepped into the storm. The wind hit her like a physical blow. The rain was so thick it tasted of iron and electricity. Visibility was down to 5 feet. The range was no longer a training ground. It was a graveyard of echoes. Somewhere in the dark, 30 elite candidates were prone in the mud, clutching rifles, their hearts hammering against their ribs like trapped birds. She moved through the muck with a predator's economy of motion. She didn't use a flashlight. In this kind of fog of war, a light is just a shoot here sign. Instead, she listened. She heard the wet squelch of a boot to her left. Then, the sound of a safety being clicked off. A tiny metallic snick that, to a trained ear, sounds as loud as a scream. "Don't," Vex whispered into the dark. A figure lunged out of the gray. It was Miller. His face was a mask of sheer, unadulterated terror, his pupils blown wide even in the dark. He was drenched, his chest heaving in jagged, sobbing gasps. He leveled his rifle at Vex's chest, his finger trembling violently on the trigger. The smell of cold sweat and ozone was suffocating. "They're in the wire," Miller shrieked, his voice cracking. "I saw them. Shadows. Moving in the tree line. We're being hunted." "Lower the weapon, Miller," Vex commanded. She didn't raise her own rifle. She stood perfectly still, a pillar of calm in a world that was melting. "You're seeing ghosts because you're breathing like a victim. Control your heart, or you'll die before the first shot is even fired." Miller's knuckles were white, the skin stretched tight over bone. He looked past her, into the swirling rain, his eyes darting frantically. He wasn't seeing a sergeant. He was seeing the end of the world. What happens when a man trained for war loses his grip on reality? The weapon in his hand becomes a liability for everyone within a mile. Suddenly, a flare hissed into the sky from the far end of the ridge. It didn't burn white or red. It burned a ghostly chemical green, casting long, sickening shadows across the mud. In that flicker of light, the truth of the breach became visible. Figures were moving through the perimeter fence, not in a tactical stack, but with a disjointed, haunting speed. They wore high-altitude rebreathers that looked like insect mandibles. These weren't soldiers. They were the Disavowed, the same unit that had turned the frozen ridges into a slaughterhouse 3 years ago. Vex's blood turned to ice. She recognized the silhouette of the lead hunter, the way he tilted his head, the way he held his blade. "Miller, get to the rally point, now!" she barked, grabbing him by the vest and shoving him toward the bunker. But Miller didn't run. He froze. His gaze was fixed on something behind Vex. A small, red laser dot had appeared on the mud between them. It danced upward, climbing Vex's boots, her waist, her chest, until it settled directly on the black ink coordinates on her neck. The silence of the mountain was punctured by a sound that didn't belong in a training exercise, a heavy, rhythmic thumping of rotor blades, flying low and dark, coming from the valley floor. The cliffhanger. Vex felt the heat of the laser on her skin, a tiny point of lethal intention. She didn't flinch. She looked Miller in the eye, the green flare reflecting in her lenses like a dying star. "They didn't come for the base, Miller," she whispered, the rain streaming down her face. "They came to finish the job." Suddenly, the ground beneath them groaned as a secondary explosion ripped through the armory, and as the firelight illuminated the rain, Vex saw a second laser dot appear, not on her, but directly on Miller's forehead. A voice hissed from a speaker hidden in the mist, using her old encrypted frequency. "Phantom 9, you have 5 seconds to choose. The boy or the secret?" The laser dot on Miller's forehead didn't pulse. It sat there, a tiny, lethal diamond of light, steady as a heartbeat in a morgue. The boy's breathing had devolved into a series of sharp, panicked hitches, his eyes bulging as he stared at Vex. He didn't even know he was a second away from being deleted. He only knew that the woman he had spent all day mocking was now the only thing standing between him and the dark. Think about the sheer, crushing weight of that choice. The boy or the secret? If Vex speaks the countercode, she reveals her location to every satellite and ghost cell still hunting for Phantom 9. She ends her life as a teacher and restarts her life as a target. If she stays silent, Miller becomes a casualty of a training accident. What would you choose? Is one life worth the safety of your own soul? Vex's hand moved. It wasn't toward her rifle. It was toward her neck. Her fingers covered the tattooed coordinates, shielding the ink from the green glare of the flare overhead. The smell of the chemical fire was acrid, stinging her nostrils, mixing with the metallic tang of the rain. "Miller," she said, her voice dropping to a frequency that seemed to vibrate in the very mud beneath them. "Don't blink. If you blink, you're dead." Suddenly, the heavy thumping of the low-flying rotors surged into a roar. A blacked-out transport helicopter swept over the ridge, its downwash flattening the mud and sending a hurricane of stinging grit into their faces. It wasn't an attack bird. It was a recovery craft. From the shadows of the tree line, 3 more laser sights bloomed. They didn't point at Miller. They pointed at the bunker where Commander Thorne was likely calling for reinforcements that would never arrive. The message was clear. This was a surgical extraction, not a massacre. Unless Vex made it one. Vex reached into her vest and pulled out a small, encrypted transponder she hadn't touched in 3 years. Her knuckles were white, the plastic casing groaning under the pressure of her grip. She looked at the red dot on Miller's brow, and then up at the dark shape of the helicopter. She keyed the mic. "This is Phantom 9, she rasped. The words felt like swallowing broken glass. "I am standing at the coordinates. Abort the secondary target. I am the only asset you need." The red dot on Miller's head vanished instantly. The relief in the air was almost physical, a sudden drop in pressure that left Miller collapsing into the mud, his rifle clattering uselessly against a rock. He vomited, the sound of his retching lost in the scream of the wind. He was alive, but the man he had been at noon, the arrogant, laughing candidate, was gone forever. Vex stood tall as the helicopter began its hover, the skids just feet above the churned earth. But then, a new sound cut through the turbine whine. A sharp, authoritative crack of a pistol fired into the air. From the direction of the command bunker, a line of floodlights erupted into life, blindingly white. Commander Thorne was marching across the range, flanked by 2 figures in dress blues, officers who didn't belong in a mud-slicked training ground. These weren't the Disavowed. The helicopter's rotors began to tilt, its pilot sensing the shift in the fog. The black-clad figures in the tree line melted back into the shadows, disappearing as if they were made of the very rain itself. They were gone in heartbeats, leaving behind nothing but the smell of ozone and a lingering sense of dread. Thorne reached Vex, his chest heaving, his face etched with a mixture of fury and profound realization. He looked at Miller, shivering in the muck, and then at Vex, who still held the carbine with the practiced ease of a reaper. "Stand down, Sergeant," Thorne commanded, though his voice lacked its usual bite. It was heavy with a new kind of respect, the kind you give to a bomb that didn't go off. Behind Thorne stepped an older man, his hair a shock of silver against the dark mountain backdrop. On his shoulders sat the heavy, polished stars of a 4-star admiral. The candidates who were still conscious on the line watched in a stunned, vibrating silence. The admiral didn't look at the base. He didn't look at the damage. He walked straight to Vex. He didn't offer a hand. He didn't offer a greeting. He stood at attention in the pouring rain, his spine as straight as a bayonet. Think about the silence of 100 men watching a legend be born in the mud. The recruits, the ones who had joked about nail salons and treasure maps, were now witnessing something that defied every regulation they knew. The admiral raised his hand to his brow. He didn't salute Thorne. He didn't salute the flag. He rendered a slow, crisp salute to Sergeant Mara Vance. "The ridges haven't forgotten, Phantom," the admiral said, his voice carrying over the dying wind. "But the world thinks you're a ghost. We need to decide tonight if you're coming back from the dead." The cliffhanger. Vex looked at the admiral, her hand slowly rising to return the salute. But as she did, the sleeve of her jacket pulled back. revealing a second set of coordinates tattooed on her inner wrist. Coordinates that Thorne's eyes immediately locked onto. His face went pale as he realized the numbers on her neck were only half of the map. Thorne stepped forward, his voice a terrified whisper. "Admiral, those aren't extraction points. Those are the strike keys for the orbital platform." Vex's eyes turned cold as she whispered back. "Then you should start praying, Commander, because the timer just hit 0. The term orbital platform didn't just hang in the air, it suffocated it. The rain seemed to freeze mid-fall as Commander Thorne stared at the second set of coordinates on Vex's wrist. Think about the staggering weight of a secret like that. You spend years looking at a person, judging their rank or their silence, never realizing they carry the literal keys to a global catastrophe under their skin. What would you do if you realized the quiet instructor was the only safety catch on a weapon of mass destruction? Thorne's hand went to his sidearm, not out of malice, but out of a raw, instinctive terror. His knuckles were bone white, his chest heaving as he looked from the Admiral to Vex. "The frozen ridges wasn't a skirmish," Thorne whispered, his voice cracking like dry timber. "It was a failed containment. You weren't protecting an extraction bird. You were protecting the uplink." The Admiral didn't blink. The water channeled down the deep lines of his face, dripping off his chin like oil. "The world isn't ready for the truth of what happened on those ridges, Commander. And it's certainly not ready for what happens if those coordinates are ever synchronized." He turned his gaze back to Vex. The salute was over, replaced by a heavy, clinical observation. "Sergeant Vance, the timer on your wrist, the one you've kept dormant for 3 years, is pinging a satellite that officially doesn't exist. Someone just activated the master key from the other side. Who else survived the ridges?" Vex didn't answer with words. She reached out and took the Admiral's heavy tactical tablet, her movements fluid and devoid of hesitation. Her fingers, scarred and steady, blurred across the glass. The high-pitched chirp of encrypted data being decrypted was the only sound against the drumming rain. Every recruit on the range was now standing in a trance-like state. Miller, still shivering in the mud, looked up at Vex as if seeing a deity carved from the mountain itself. The mockery was dead. The laughter was a ghost. In its place was a hollow, echoing reverence. They were watching the human element collide with the highest stakes imaginable. "It's not a person," Vex finally said. Her voice was a low, resonant thrum that seemed to vibrate in the very marrow of those listening. "It's an automated failsafe. The Disavowed didn't come here to kill me. They came here to trigger the proximity alert. By standing here, by surviving, I've accidentally validated the final strike sequence." She turned the screen toward the Admiral. A map of the globe was pulsing with a faint, ghostly blue light, centered on a specific point in the desert, the coordinates on her neck. But a second pulse, a blood-red ring, was expanding from the coordinates on her wrist. Have you ever felt the moment when the world tilts? When you realize every choice you've made has led to a single, irreversible second? Vex wasn't a victim of her past anymore. She was the architect of the future. "We have 12 minutes before the platform achieves a kinetic solution," Vex stated. She looked at the candidates, at Miller, at the men who had doubted her. "You wanted to see what it takes to be elite? It isn't about the shooting, it's about the burden. You carry the weight until your spine snaps, and then you stand up and carry it some more." She walked toward the flagpole at the center of the range. The wind whipped the heavy canvas of the flag, creating a sound like a snapping whip. She reached into her pocket and pulled out a small, metallic cylinder, a physical override key she had carried since the day the ridges fell. "Commander," she said, not looking back, "if I do this, Sergeant Vance ceases to exist. There will be no record of me, no pension, no history. I go back into the dark. Do you still want to know what these numbers mean?" Thorne stood paralyzed. He saw the sweat beads on her upper lip, the slight tremor in her hand that she was fighting with every ounce of her will. He realized that her silence all these years wasn't a choice, it was a sacrifice. She had been protecting them from a reality that would keep them awake for the rest of their lives. "Do it," Thorne whispered. Vex slammed the override key into the base of the communications array. The electronics groaned, a high-pitched whine that set everyone's teeth on edge. The red ring on the tablet began to shrink, pulling back toward the center of the screen, dying out until only a single, steady blue dot remained. The ghost had retreated. The world was safe, but the cost was visible in the way Vex's shoulders finally, for the first time, slumped. The Admiral stepped forward, his face unreadable. "You're dead again, Vance. As far as the Pentagon is concerned, this base was hit by a localized weather anomaly. You were never here." The cliffhanger. Vex nodded, her eyes lingering on the coordinates on her skin one last time before she pulled her glove tight, masking the numbers forever. She began to walk away into the swirling gray mist of the mountain, leaving the recruits and the officers behind like statues in the rain. But as she reached the perimeter fence, her radio, the one she had deactivated, suddenly burst into a clear, undistorted signal. A child's voice, small and terrified, whispered through the static. "Mom? The man in the veil says the timer didn't stop. He says it just changed targets." Vex froze, her eyes widening as she looked up at the sky, and the video cuts to black as a second sun begins to bloom behind the clouds.